We finally found it. I've been systematically going through every letter of the alphabet and investing $1,000 into a company that starts with that letter. When you go through so many companies like this, what you're really hoping to find is something that is small and overlooked, where you can get a really good deal. But up to this point, the smallest company we've been able to find has been like $8.5 billion market cap. So for the letter G, the seventh letter of the alphabet, we were up to about $7,000 invested. And if we had just been taking that money and investing it systematically into the S&P, we would have netted $294 up to this point. The way we've been doing it, we are netting $468. We are about 59% better off. However, the investment that we made in the letter G is down a solid 7.3%, which means that I am down a very real $73. The company we're investing in this week for the letter H is Hingham Institution for Saving, headquartered in Hingham, Massachusetts, which is a small town outside of Boston. It's a very old bank. It's been around for almost 190 years now. It was founded in 1834. Now, we're not going to start that far back. In fact, we're going to fast forward to 1993. And I want you to imagine that you're going through the annual report of some company that you own and just checking in on how things are doing. And you see a passage where the president is telling you that there is a small group of shareholders that are trying to take over your company. That's a little concerning. But that's exactly what happened at Hingham in 1993. There was a proxy war when the person that wrote that, Paul Bullman, was essentially charged with embezzling from the company for taking kickbacks and payoffs for bad loans. He embezzled about $240,000, which is much more impactful to the value of the bank than the actual net money he made, and is also inflation adjusted closer to about $500,000 in today's money. The proxy war was initiated and waged by this man, Robert Goggin. And this is not a guy I would want to mess with. Just look at his eyes. This is a guy who is a shark, right? He smells blood in the water. And things started to turn around almost immediately. Not to say it wasn't a lot of work, but the improvements were very obvious very quickly. The amount of loans they were originating, which is essentially the amount of business that the bank is drumming up, improved by 109% compared to how they were doing before. On top of that, not only were they doing more business, they were doing better business. The amount of bad loans that were being made decreased by about 71%. Before we make an investment in a company, we have to understand what that company actually does. In case of Hingham, it's really just a bank. It's a bank sort of like any other bank. But in 2023, being a bank is not really good enough. You've got to be doing something special. And one thing that they do special is that they have one of the lowest efficiency ratios ever. It's kind of like, how do they even do this? We're going to talk about how they do it. But first, what do they actually do? What is their day-to-day? Well, they make loans. But unlike most banks, they make loans on a very specialized category, which is essentially just homes. They only really do homes. They are self-proclaimed dirt lenders, right? So they take the money they have and they look at a house or building and they say, I would like that as collateral. And then they find out who owns that building because it's pretty public, and they call them and they tell them what they do. And that is how they drum up business. So a lot of this is just going to be straight from their investor slides because they've done such a great job. So what do? They do commercial lending, residential lending, and deposits. And that's pretty much the whole business. So what do they not do? They basically will not give a loan against something that is not a building or a piece of land or something of that sort. Now, this doesn't always happen, but the more I learn about Hingham, the more I like it. It's always cool when you have a CEO that you can sort of just like watch age over time. Like you can literally just watch his hair going gray. However, not everything is smooth sailing, of course. They didn't know it in 1993, but the dot-com crash was right around the corner. And it did not really affect them much, actually. The new technology didn't really ruin their business. In fact, it helped them find new and innovative ways to visualize their data. And they already had a website in 1998. In 2008, especially given the business they're in with almost entirely real estate, it was a big deal for them. It, in fact, caused them to have their first bad loan in 7 years. If you look at this chart for their book value, you'll see that those two events are tiny dents in the overall scheme of things. In fact, in 2009, Goggin points out something that sounds a little bit obvious in hindsight, but at the time would have sounded a little bit crazy, which is that the 2008 financial crisis was a huge opportunity for small regional banks. You've got a bunch of displaced depositors that need to find a bank now. And all of the large banks have essentially imploded on themselves. So where else are they going to go? And then Hingham gets to put in the work to get that business. Now we know the service that the business provides to society, which is essentially banking, and that they've been doing it for over a century and a half, which is a crazy number. But on top of that, we also need to know that society wants them to be doing that they are obsessed and in tune with the customer's needs. And one of the ways that we can do that is by looking at how they get that efficiency ratio so low. And at this point, their efficiency ratio is pushing like 25%, which is a crazy number. Most banks, if they get that number below 50%, are very happy. And one of the ways they do that is a customer-focused strategy. So it's a sort of commonly known thing in business that keeping an existing customer is more efficient than acquiring a new customer. About 50% of Hingham's customers are repeat customers. They've worked with them before, they've done a deal, they like the process, they like the result, and they've come back for more. And on top of that, the remaining 50%, 60% of those people are new customers that were recommended from a prior customer. They were asked how they're going to build a new business, and they say brick by brick, right? You knock on one door at a time, you build the business one customer at a time. And this can also be seen in their very transparent capital allocation strategy. So they have organic growth, which is basically the things we've been talking about so far, adding to the business, cutting costs, things like that. There's equity investments, either public or private, and always within their circle of competence, which is basically just financial services. There's the dividend. So whenever you invest in a business, you're a partial owner in that business, and you want to have some share in the profit that the business is making. And they admit that, and you want it to be stable, so they pay it out quarterly. But in the years where they've made more than they can reinvest, above and beyond the dividend they're already paying, they usually pay a fourth quarter special dividend to fill that gap. And then there's the buybacks, which they have actually never done. They've never done a buyback, but they are totally willing to. They have certain regulatory costs and taxes that they would have to pay because they are not a bank holding company, they're just a bank. But if the value of the stock ever got below those costs plus the intrinsic value, they would totally be willing to buy back shares. And what they don't do is acquisitions, right? So controlling interests. So we were talking about the equity investments before, those were non-controlling interests. A controlling interest is usually a lot more expensive and has some imaginary or illusory benefits that they tend to call synergies that rarely ever manifest. Another way they get their efficiency ratio so low is by hyper-specializing. So not only are they really focused in commercial real estate, they are not really focused on things like office real estate. And they're also focused on primarily coastal cities, right? So they are in Hingham, near Boston, they're in Washington, and they have just recently ventured out into San Francisco. So another thing they've been doing to increase the quality of loans and therefore decrease the efficiency ratio and improve the net interest margin is to have an executive committee review every single loan given. In fact, no one in the business, no individual has loan authority, right? So even the president can't look at a loan and say, I'm approving this loan. You have to go through the executive committee. And the executive committee is usually a terrible idea. It usually doesn't work. So how is Hingham getting this to work? Well, they're doing a couple things. They are getting everyone involved to have a significant amount of experience, right? These are competent people in either banking or real estate or some other relevant field. And then on top of that, each member of the executive committee has a substantial equity stake in Hingham itself. But even with all this robustness, the bank is not immune to the things that no bank is immune to, right? So if the yield curve inverts, that is bad. that is bad for the bank. It essentially means that people are valuing short-term commitments more than they're valuing long-term commitments, which is not good because the bank is pretty much in the business of making long-term financial commitments. And this has led to some of the largest bank failures in recent history. You might have heard of Silicon Valley Bank, which was headquarters in San Francisco, right where Hingham was trying to extend. But what you might not know is that one of the largest banks in Boston was acquired by Silicon Valley Bank before they went bankrupt. So now you've got their primary market and their new sort of emerging market that they're going into that have these wide gaps in them where they have displaced customers and displaced bankers. And these are two of the largest, most important things for a bank to grow, which is that it is very hard to get a customer to switch from one bank to the next because they're pretty commoditized and they just don't really have a reason to. But if a bank goes bankrupt, then they now have a reason to. And on top of that, especially with Hingham being such a small company, they only have like 92 employees or something like that. So each employee has to be very high quality, especially if they want to keep that efficiency ratio down. And one thing that happens is that when a bank goes bankrupt, there are a lot of qualified out-of-work bankers. And that does not happen very often. A lot of the time, if you have a great banker at a bank, they're pretty happy in their position and they stay there. When one bank goes down, the fear is that any other bank could also go with it, especially small ones, especially a bank like Hingham that's so similar. But one thing about Massachusetts is that they are not only FDIC insured, they are state insured above and beyond that. So the deposits at the Hingham Bank are essentially 100% insured. The final and most important thing we have to look at when viewing a business or stock as an investment is the price that it's being sold for. And in the case of Hingham, I think there is a lot of residual negativity coming from the Silicon Valley Bank crisis, when in fact it could be a positive for them if they put in the work and are able to capitalize on the gaps in the market that were created. Now, the yield curve being inverted is bad for them. It is a really painful thing for a bank to live through in the short term, but they have lived through things like this before, and I am confident that by at least 2025, they will be pretty much recovered, which is why this week, for the letter H, we got $1,000.64 of Hingham Institution for Savings at $225.57 a share.